In the summer of 1966, in the small town of Twinsburg, Ohio, a 6-year-old boy named Patrick McCondy was counting down the days until his family could move into the new house his father was building. His story, first documented in a 1998 edition of Fate magazine, would take more than 2 decades to fully emerge. It was only 2 blocks away from the apartment where they currently lived, but for Patrick, that short distance couldn't come soon enough. He wanted to leave something behind, something that had happened to him in that apartment complex, something he couldn't quite explain but knew wasn't right. It would take another 20 years before Patrick would fully understand what that something was. The McCondy family's neighbours at the apartment complex were Dutch, and they had friends arriving from the Netherlands who were set to move into the apartment directly across the street. Patrick's parents had been told that these arrivals had a daughter roughly the same age as their son, a girl named Lizette, and the Dutch neighbours were certain the 2 children would make great playmates. Patrick, however, wasn't enthusiastic. When Lizette and her family arrived, she spent the entire summer, as Patrick would later put it, trying to be one of the boys, and his feelings about her remained decidedly mixed. Despite his reservations about Lizette, one particular day, her parents approached Patrick's mother and father with a request. They wanted Patrick to join them for an outing to the movies, followed by dinner, and then to spend the night at their apartment. Patrick's parents agreed, and the evening began pleasantly enough. The movie was enjoyable, the meal was good, and afterward they returned to the apartment across the street. Patrick changed into his pajamas and prepared for bed. He was to sleep in Lizette's room, while Lizette herself would be sleeping between her parents in their bedroom. This meant Patrick would be entirely alone, but he didn't think much of it. He went to sleep without incident. Sometime later, Patrick woke up. What he saw made no sense. Lizette's parents were right there, close to the bed, leaning over him and staring at his face. The noses were only inches from his own. The experience was deeply unsettling, and whether he passed out from fright or simply fell back asleep, he couldn't say. But when he woke up again, everything had changed completely. Patrick found himself standing outside in the yard between the 2 apartment buildings, looking up at the sky. What he saw there was a bright beam of light, roughly 10 to 12 feet across. He watched as this light grew smaller, moving upward and away from him. Then, something even stranger happened. A voice appeared inside his head. Not a sound from outside, but words forming directly in his thoughts. The voice told him, "We will see you again someday, when you are a lot older." At that moment, Patrick became aware that Lizette's parents were also standing outside. They quickly guided him back toward the apartment, and he returned to bed. Patrick remembered feeling terrified, and what disturbed him even more was the sound of Lizette's parents laughing as they brought him back inside. That laughter frightened him almost as much as the beam of light in the sky. The next day, when Patrick was back with his own parents, he told them about the bizarre events of the previous night. His mother and father listened, but they insisted he must have had a nightmare, probably caused by rich food his stomach wasn't used to. Patrick didn't argue. He stopped talking about what had happened and tried to put it out of his mind. But even as the years passed, he never fully forgot that night. Deep down, he knew something extraordinary had occurred outside those apartments. Several years after the incident in Twinsburg, the McCondy family relocated to Youngstown, Ohio, after Patrick's father accepted a position as advertising director for a grocery chain. As Patrick grew into a young man, the strange memories of that summer night faded into the background. He went on to build a successful career as a model, working in men's fashion and traveling to high-end photo shoots in New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. Life was good, and the events of 1966 seemed like nothing more than a distant, half-remembered childhood dream. Then, one muggy evening in August 1987, everything came rushing back. Patrick had an important photo shoot scheduled for the following day, a catalogue session for swimwear, and he decided to go to bed early so he would look and feel his best. But as the night wore on, a strange sensation crept over him. He began to feel afraid, as though something was about to happen. Then, without warning, a small transparent ball of light appeared in his room. It moved toward him, hovering and darting around his head and face like a bee. Patrick tried to swat at it, but the more he swung at the orb, the more exhausted he became. Eventually, the fatigue overwhelmed him and he fell asleep. When Patrick woke the next morning, he felt tired and weak, as if coming down with the flu. Still, he got himself ready for the photo shoot, and by the time he left his apartment, he was feeling somewhat better. At the studio, as he changed into the first bathing suit, the owner of the company approached him with a puzzled expression. She was looking at his torso, and she said something that stopped Patrick cold. She told him she didn't remember him having so many scars. Patrick looked down in shock. There, spread across his upper torso, were approximately 15 scars that he had never seen before. Though completely unfamiliar, the scars appeared to be several months old. The makeup artist covered them, and Patrick completed the photo shoot, but his mind was racing. What had happened to him? Where had these marks come from? On his way home that evening, Patrick found himself driving through a route that took him close to Twinsburg. Almost without thinking, he decided to make a detour to visit the apartment where he had lived with his parents as a child and the apartment where Lizette's family had lived. As he drove past that building, something extraordinary happened. A flashback surged through his mind with overwhelming force. He remembered standing in the yard outside the apartment on that night more than 20 years earlier. He remembered the beam of light, but now he could see more. The light was coming from a ship hovering above him. He could see a row of coloured lights along its surface, lights and hues that didn't exist in any colour spectrum he knew. And in that moment of sudden recall, Patrick understood the truth. He had been taken by entities not of this world. Not just on that night when he was 6 years old, but also the night before, from his own bed in his own apartment. The realization hit him so hard that he pushed open his car door and vomited onto the street. Patrick sat back in his seat and tried to compose himself. As he sat there, more memories came flooding back. He took several minutes to process this information before he felt steady enough to drive home. What surprised him was that despite the bizarre nature of these recovered memories, he didn't feel afraid. Instead, he felt a strange certainty that these visitors, as he came to think of them, had completed whatever work they had been doing with him. He believed he would not see them again. He also described feeling cleansed, convinced that something had been placed inside him when he was a young child, some kind of implant, and that it had been removed only the night before during the encounter with the ball of light. Patrick couldn't recall the specific procedures or experiments performed on him. He believed his memory had been deliberately wiped because the knowledge would have been too painful to carry. But despite not knowing what had been done to him or why, he felt he had received something in return. He described gaining new insights and a greater sense of the universe. Patrick came to think of these abilities as gifts, a strange form of gratitude from his abductors for whatever he had unknowingly contributed to their purposes. It was about a year after that day when Patrick first became aware of these abilities. He was at a nightclub in Austintown, Ohio, with several friends, all pressed against the bar in the crowded venue. Suddenly, Patrick heard a strange humming noise, and without thinking, he jumped up so that he was sitting on the bar. A split second later, a fight broke out nearby, and a large, heavy-set man brought a beer bottle crashing down on the head of the person who had been sitting right next to Patrick. If Patrick had not moved when he did, he might have been seriously injured, perhaps even fatally. His friends couldn't understand how he had known to jump out of the way. Patrick couldn't explain it either. All he knew was that he had sensed imminent danger and acted on instinct. Patrick also discovered that he had developed a gift for a kind of precognition. Several months later, at the same nightclub, he was talking with his friends when, without consciously thinking, he finished one of their sentences, not just the general idea, but word for word. The experience spooked her so badly that she refused to speak to him afterward, accusing him of being some kind of warlock. He also found that he could tell when a telephone was about to ring, hearing a faint humming sound in his head several seconds before it would start ringing. But there were even more remarkable abilities that Patrick discovered. One day in the summer of 1990, he was in his yard when a strange dog wandered in. He looked at the animal and, without fully realizing what he was doing, he beckoned the dog to come to him, using only his thoughts. He repeated the command in his mind, and to his amazement, the dog walked over. Thinking it might have been coincidence, he mentally asked the dog to give him its paw. The dog immediately lifted its paw and offered it to Patrick. The following day, he had another opportunity to test this ability. He was walking down his street when he saw one of his neighbours walking their dog, a friendly poodle that Patrick had never heard growl or bark. Patrick stopped to make small talk, and his neighbour walked over to show him the engine of his new Camaro. While his neighbour looked under the hood, Patrick looked at the dog, then back at the neighbour, and in his mind he imagined hitting the man. Instantly, the poodle began growling and barking at Patrick, snarling and attempting to bite him. The neighbour was shocked by his dog's sudden aggression. Patrick, however, understood exactly what had happened. He had communicated his imagined hostile intent to the animal telepathically. Patrick put this ability to the test a third time several years later when a street fair came to his hometown. One of the exhibits featured a lion and its trainer. Patrick approached the owner and asked if he could pet the 3-year-old lion. The owner refused, warning Patrick would be chewed up alive. But Patrick decided to prove him wrong. When the owner took a break and left the lion in its cage, Patrick snuck inside. Not only was he not attacked by the wild animal, but he was able to soothe it to sleep. When the owner returned a short time later, he found his lion calmly lying next to Patrick without a care in the world. By the winter of 1997, Patrick began having vivid dreams that told him of events about to happen, sometimes the very next day. One night he dreamed of a neighbour he hadn't seen for over 5 years. The following day, that same neighbour arrived at his house out of the blue. On another occasion, he dreamed of the person he had recently sold a car to. The next day, that person knocked on his door to tell him how pleased they were with their purchase. A short time later, Patrick had a more troubling dream featuring his aunt. In the dream, she was sick and asking the family for help. His aunt did call the next day to inform him she was ill. What made this even stranger was that Patrick's father had the exact same dream that night. But these abilities came with a darker side. Following his second encounter in 1987, Patrick developed a severe fear of flying, not a fear of heights, but something stemming from being on board the visitor's ship. He also developed a sudden fear of visiting the dentist or doctor. During one routine dental appointment, the sensation of metallic instruments in his mouth caused him to fly out of the chair and run down the hallway. He attributed these fears to his subconscious memories of whatever procedures had been performed on him during his abductions. There was one more revelation to come, and it arrived after Patrick's story was published in the September 1998 edition of Fate magazine. Upon reading the article, Patrick's father had a sudden recall of his own. He was so affected that he was moved to tears. He told Patrick that after reading the account, he remembered what he had always believed was a terrible, vivid nightmare from the summer of 1966. In this so-called nightmare, Patrick's father saw an extremely bright light outside his bedroom window. He got out of bed and walked over to investigate. When he pulled back the curtain, he was shocked to see his young son standing in the yard across the road, dressed only in his pajamas, looking up at something overhead. Then Lizette's parents appeared and led Patrick back inside their apartment. Patrick's father looked up just in time to see a large object rising into the sky before it disappeared. It seems clear now that what Patrick's father experienced was not a nightmare at all. He had witnessed at least part of his son's abduction that summer night in 1966. Whether his mind blocked out the memory on its own, or whether technology was used by the visitors to suppress his recall, remains unknown. It's even possible Patrick's father himself was taken that night. Patrick McCondy's account contains details that align with many other reported cases of alien abduction, and the abilities he gained afterward have been described by others who claim similar encounters. It must be said that none of these abilities were ever formally tested or verified under controlled conditions, and as with most cases of this nature, we are left to rely on anecdotal evidence alone. Whether these abilities are intentional gifts from extraterrestrial visitors, some unintended consequence of the experience, or something else entirely remains unanswered. Patrick himself believed his purpose to these otherworldly beings had been fulfilled, and he had no interest in exploring his encounters further. But his story, first told more than 2 decades after that night in Twinsburg, continues to resonate with researchers who study these phenomena, adding one more piece to a puzzle that humanity may never fully solve.